Prosecutors say a man admitted to a murder in Island County more than 20 years ago, but they can't charge the suspect.
In 2021, inside a maximum security prison in Arizona, a killer finally spoke. After nearly 2 decades of silence, he was ready to confess to the murder of Tamara Matson, a brutal killing that had haunted Washington state investigators since 2003. But this wasn't going to be the victory detectives had spent years fighting for. In a cruel twist of fate, the very words that would solve this case would also be the ones that made justice impossible. December 2003, a woman's body was discovered at Camino Island State Park, beaten and abandoned among the winter frost. Tammy Matson, a mother of 7, had met a violent end near a park entrance where families spent their weekends. For years, investigators worked tirelessly, following leads that led nowhere, while her killer lived freely, believing he had committed the perfect crime. But sometimes solving a murder is only half the battle. What followed would become one of the most frustrating conclusions in Washington state's criminal history. A confession bound by legal red tape, a prosecution derailed by time itself, and a haunting reminder that the truth doesn't always set you free.
I'm thankful that we know for sure, but I always knew, and her mother always knew, it was Carl.
Before she became the center of one of Washington's most frustrating cold cases, Tammy Matson was a mother fighting her own battles in Everett, Washington. Living in a modest home, she shouldered the immense responsibility of raising 7 children on her own. Those who knew her described a woman of remarkable resilience, someone who, despite the odds stacked against her, never stopped trying to create a better life for her family. But beneath her determination lay a struggle that would ultimately lead her down a dangerous path. Like many, caught in the grip of addiction, Tammy's involvement with drugs wasn't just a personal battle. It became a desperate means of survival. The local drug scene in Everett had a way of turning victims into casualties. And Tammy found herself navigating an increasingly treacherous world where trust was scarce and threats were common. Yet, those who loved her remember a different Tammy. Her children recall a mother who, despite her struggles, showed up with unwavering love. She was the kind of mom who would skip meals to ensure her kids had enough to eat, who worked whatever jobs she could find to keep a roof over their heads. Her sister would later tell investigators that Tammy had dreams of breaking free from addiction, of giving her children the stability they deserved. She wasn't just another statistic in the war on drugs. She was a woman caught between her demons and her dreams. In early December 2003, Tammy vanished from her usual haunts in Everett. At first, her disappearance didn't raise immediate alarms. She had occasionally disappeared before, usually returning within a few days. But this time was different. This time, Tammy wouldn't be coming home. Instead, her story would become entwined with a state park 30 miles away, where a morning walk was about to turn into a nightmare. December 9th, 2003. The morning air at Camino Island State Park carried the sharp bite of winter. The park, known for its sweeping views of Puget Sound and trails winding through towering evergreens, was quieter than usual. Tourist season had ended months ago, leaving the grounds to local joggers and the occasional nature enthusiast. It was one such morning visitor who first spotted something out of place near the park's entrance. At first glance, it appeared to be discarded clothing, partially obscured by brush. But as they moved closer, the horrifying reality became clear. It wasn't clothing at all, but a human body. Within hours, the serene park transformed into a bustling crime scene. Yellow tape creating a stark contrast against the winter-dulled foliage. Detective Mark Thompson of the Island County Sheriff's Office would later describe it as one of the most violent crime scenes he'd encountered. Tammy's body showed signs of a brutal assault. Severe trauma to her head and neck told a story of rage and deadly force. The medical examiner would later confirm what seemed painfully obvious. This wasn't a natural death, nor was it an accident. Tammy Matson had been murdered. The crime scene team worked methodically, photographing and collecting evidence as weak December sunlight filtered through the trees. They found a cigarette butt near her body, seemingly insignificant at the time, but carefully bagged and labeled nonetheless. The position of her body suggested she'd been killed elsewhere and dumped at the park, likely days before she was found. The killer had chosen the location carefully, just secluded enough to avoid immediate detection, but accessible enough for a quick getaway. As news crews began arriving at the park's perimeter, detectives were already piecing together their first crucial timeline. Tammy had last been seen in Everett, some 30 miles away. How did she end up here? Who had brought her to this peaceful park only to end her life so violently? And most importantly, had the killer left behind enough evidence for investigators to bring them to justice? The questions were many, but answers would prove frustratingly elusive. This was only the beginning of what would become one of Washington's most complex investigations. The Island County Sheriff's Office faced an uphill battle from day one. With no witnesses, no surveillance footage, and a crime scene that had been exposed to December's harsh elements, detectives knew they were working against both time and nature. Their first priority was establishing Tammy's final movements. Interviews with her acquaintances in Everett painted a troubling picture. Tammy had last been seen alive around December 5th, frequenting areas known for drug activity. Several people remembered seeing her get into a car with an unknown man, a detail that would haunt investigators for years to come. But in the shadowy world of street-level drug deals, witnesses were scarce and memories conveniently fuzzy. Those who might have known something remained silent, bound by the unwritten code of the streets. Detective Thompson and his team worked tirelessly, following every possible lead. They collected dozens of witness statements, mapped out potential routes between Everett and Camano Island, and dug deep into Tammy's known associates. The cigarette butt found near her body was sent to the Washington State Crime Lab, but DNA testing in 2003 wasn't what it would later become. The sample was preserved, but initial results proved inconclusive. As weeks turned into months, the investigation hit one dead end after another. Tammy's connection to the drug scene had exposed her to countless potential suspects, each lead seemingly promising until it unraveled under scrutiny. The brutal nature of the crime suggested personal motivation, yet no one in her immediate circle emerged as a viable suspect. It was as if her killer had materialized from thin air, committed this heinous act, and vanished just as mysteriously.
She was on my mind. Christmas, her children's birthdays. She'd have been at Grandma now.
By the summer of 2004, the case had gone cold. The evidence board in the sheriff's office stood as a silent testament to countless hours of investigation. Photos, timelines, and witness statements connected by red strings that led nowhere. Local media coverage dwindled, and new cases demanded attention. But for Detective Thompson, something about Tammy's case refused to let go. There was just something about this one, he would later recall, the violence of it, the way she was discarded like she didn't matter. And those 7 kids left behind. How do you walk away from that? The case file might have been labeled cold, but it was far from forgotten. As it turned out, the key to solving Tammy's murder was already in police possession, silently waiting for science to catch up with justice. But when it finally did, investigators would face an entirely new set of challenges that no one could have anticipated. For years, the cigarette butt sat in evidence storage, its secrets locked away in strands of DNA that 2003 technology couldn't fully decode. It rested in a small evidence bag, labeled and cataloged alongside countless other pieces of evidence from unsolved cases, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up with justice. But in 2009, as forensic science leaped forward with groundbreaking advancements in DNA analysis, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab launched an ambitious initiative to revisit evidence from cold cases across the state. When they re-examined the cigarette butt from Tammy's case, everything changed. This time, using cutting-edge extraction techniques and more sensitive testing methods, they were able to extract a complete DNA profile, a genetic fingerprint of someone who had been at the crime scene. It was like finding a signature left in invisible ink, finally revealed after years of waiting for the right technology. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, where it would spend the next decade silently searching for a match among millions of profiles from across the country, like a digital detective working tirelessly around the clock. Then, on a seemingly ordinary morning in 2019, Detective Thompson received the call he'd been waiting 16 years for. His hands trembled as he jotted down the details. The DNA had matched to a man named Carl D. Schlobaum. What they learned about him sent chills through the investigation team. Schlobaum wasn't just any match. He was already serving a life sentence in Arizona for another murder. In 2005, 2 years after Tammy's death, he had brutally killed a woman in California in a crime that bore chilling similarities to Tammy's murder. The victim had been beaten and strangled, her body disposed of in a secluded area, marking a pattern that was impossible to ignore. As investigators dug into Schlobaum's background, the pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Records showed he had deep connections to the Linwood area, just minutes from where Tammy lived in Everett. Employment records, rental agreements, and witness statements painted a picture of a man who had spent years moving between Washington and California, flying under law enforcement's radar. During the time of Tammy's murder, he had been working odd jobs in the Everett area, frequenting the same neighborhoods where Tammy was last seen. The timing, the location, the pattern of violence, everything pointed to Schlobaum like arrows on a map. But DNA on a cigarette butt, while damning, wasn't enough for a conviction. It placed him at the scene but couldn't prove he was the killer. In the complex world of criminal prosecution, proximity doesn't equal guilt. Investigators needed more. They needed Schlobaum's own words.
And I called and I'd have a conversation and they would explain to me they don't have enough, and if they heard anything, they'd let me know.
In late 2019, Detectives Thompson and Garcia boarded a plane to Arizona, their briefcases heavy with 16 years' worth of evidence. They came armed with the DNA evidence, crime scene photos, and years of investigative experience, hoping to get the one thing that had eluded them for so long, a confession. The interview room at the Arizona State Prison complex was cold and stark, much like the man sitting across from them. Schlobaum, hardened by years in maximum security, proved to be a wall of silence. Every question was met with a blank stare or a dismissive shrug. He refused to discuss Tammy or acknowledge any connection to Washington State. His eyes, Detective Garcia would later recall, were like looking into empty wells, dark and bottomless. The detectives left Arizona empty-handed, their hopes of a quick resolution dashed. But they weren't done, and something about their visit must have struck a nerve with Schlobaum. 2 years later, in 2021, a letter arrived at the Island County Sheriff's Office, its Arizona prison postmark instantly recognizable. It was from Schlobaum, and its contents would crack the case wide open, while simultaneously creating an impossible situation for prosecutors. He was ready to talk about Tammy's murder, but he had conditions. He wanted what's known in legal circles as a free talk, a conversation under immunity where his words couldn't be used against him in court. For investigators, it was a devil's bargain. The very thing they had sought for nearly 2 decades. The truth about what happened to Tammy was finally within reach, but at what cost? The free talk arrangement was a calculated risk, one that seasoned investigators like Detective Thompson knew could be a double-edged sword. Such agreements were rare in murder cases, typically reserved for lesser crimes or conspiracy investigations. But after 16 years of dead ends, the truth about Tammy's final moments had become as valuable as a conviction. In early 2021, in a sterile prison interview room in Arizona State Penitentiary, surrounded by concrete walls and fluorescent lights, Carl Schlobaum finally began to talk. His confession was chillingly detailed, delivered with the casual demeanor of someone discussing a mundane errand. He described meeting Tammy during a drug deal gone wrong in Everett, near an abandoned warehouse that investigators had previously identified as a known meeting spot for users and dealers. What started as an argument over money, Schlobaum claimed Tammy had shorted him on a payment, escalated into violence. His temper, he admitted, had exploded in a way that had become his signature, a pattern that would later be recognized in his California murder. The way he described it, Detective Thompson would later say in a closed-door briefing, was like someone recalling what they had for breakfast. No emotion, no remorse, just cold, hard facts. In all my years on the force, I'd never seen someone recount a murder with such detachment. Every detail Schlabbaum shared matched the evidence that they'd gathered, filling in gaps that had haunted investigators for years. He knew about marks on her body that had never been released to the public, described the exact position she was found in, even remembered the brand of cigarette he'd smoked before leaving her body, the very cigarette that would ultimately lead to his identification. The route he'd taken to Camano Island caught investigators' attention particularly. It wasn't the most direct path. Instead, he'd chosen back roads and less traveled routes that someone unfamiliar with the area wouldn't have known about. This suggested premeditation, a calculated plan to dispose of her body where it might not be found quickly. He even described waiting in his car at the park entrance for several minutes to ensure no other vehicles were around before dragging her body into the brush. But even as they finally learned the truth about Tammy's last moments, a cruel irony was taking shape in the interview room. The very immunity agreement that had loosened Schlobam's tongue now bound the prosecutor's hands like invisible shackles. Without the ability to use his confession in court, they would need to build a case solely on circumstantial evidence and the DNA match from the cigarette butt. It was a prosecutor's nightmare, having a killer's full confession, but being legally unable to use it. Then came the final devastating twist. Shortly after his confession, Schlobam's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Prison guards reported increasingly erratic behavior. He would forget conversations minutes after having them, became disoriented in the familiar prison corridors, and sometimes couldn't recognize his own attorneys. Medical evaluations in early 2024 confirmed what his increasingly confused behavior had suggested. He was suffering from advanced dementia, likely accelerated by years of drug use prior to his incarceration. The man who had finally revealed the truth about Tammy's murder was now legally incompetent to stand trial. The timing couldn't have been more frustrating. Just when investigators had unlocked all the answers they'd spent years searching for, the possibility of justice slipped through their fingers like sand. Schlobam's failing mental state meant he could no longer understand legal proceedings, let alone provide testimony or face charges. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. His memory of the murder had been crystal clear during the confession, but now his mind was rapidly erasing even the present. For Detective Thompson and his team, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had solved the case, identified the killer, and even obtained a confession, yet they couldn't bring him to justice. The very system designed to protect rights and ensure fair trials had created an impossible situation. They had their killer, but he would never face charges for Tammy's murder. Sometimes truth and justice travel different paths, and in Tammy's case, they would never intersect in a courtroom. By early 2024, the Island County Prosecutor's Office faced an impossible decision. With Schlobam's advanced dementia ruling out any possibility of prosecution, they had to determine how to officially close a case that had consumed thousands of investigative hours over 2 decades. The evidence was clear. They had their killer, but the path to justice had been blocked by a perfect storm of legal constraints and cruel timing. The DNA match from the cigarette butt, while crucial in identifying Schlobam, could only prove his presence at the scene. His detailed confession, protected by the immunity agreement of the Free Talk, was legally inadmissible. And now, with his mind ravaged by dementia, even a new confession was impossible. The man who had murdered Tammy was still alive, but the person who could be held legally accountable for her death no longer existed in the eyes of the law.
And today's just kind of opens up an old wound, you know. I'm glad that it's finally over.
For Tammy's family, the resolution brought a complicated mix of emotions. Finally, knowing the truth about their mother's death provided a certain closure. But watching her killer escape prosecution due to legal technicalities and declining health felt like another form of injustice. The system that was supposed to protect victims and their families had instead created an insurmountable barrier to accountability. In March 2024, the Island County Sheriff's Office officially closed Tammy's case. The file would show Carl D. Schlobum as her killer, backed by DNA evidence and his own confession, but with no formal charges filed. He would remain in an Arizona prison, serving his life sentence for another murder, while the justice system in Washington state could only acknowledge but not punish his role in Tammy's death. Detective Thompson, in his final report, wrote words that would haunt many involved in the case. Sometimes solving a murder and achieving justice are two very different things. In Tammy's case, we accomplished one, but were denied the other.
He's not charged with Tammy's murder, but he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And he has to answer to one. He's going to have to answer to one much bigger.
What do you think about cases like Tammy's? Should immunity deals be handled differently when it comes to cold cases? How do we balance the need for truth with the pursuit of justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story important, please consider sharing it to help keep Tammy's memory alive. Sometimes remembering is the only justice we can offer.